Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. 𝐊𝐸 here for 𝐾𝐈 TV. Welcome you all to another edition of Executive Corner Expert Talks. The show where we bring to you industry leaders, successful business owners and market experts all under one roof to help you discover the latest economic insights. Today we're joined by Quan Heng Lim, the Regional Head of Asia at Privasec, one of the fastest growing independent security, governance, risk and compliance consulting firms. Welcome to the show, Quan. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, Holly.
Great to have you on. So to kick things off, cyber attacks are increasing in frequency, sophistication and impact, with perpetrators continually refining their efforts to compromise systems, networks and information worldwide. What would you say are the key catalysts of the rise of cybercrime?
So using Singapore as an example, last year cybercrime actually made up 43% of overall crime. So it's definitely been an increase over the last few years. When we talk about crime, it all goes back to means, motive and opportunity. So looking at the past year, there's definitely a lot of new threats coming up linked to COVID-19, because attackers are using that as a venue to create a sense of urgency, to get people to do things they wouldn't usually do. But the same thing can be done with other venues, such as phishing by pretending to be a government official, as an example. Now, there's also rapid growth of e-commerce, proliferation of community marketplaces, social media platforms, and these days even government agencies are using online solutions for simple things like payment of bills. Now, it varies across different regions of the world, depending on factors such as smartphone penetration and the maturity of regulatory and industry bodies in the form of guidelines and regulations. But some guidelines and some regulatory bodies are just playing a catch-up game. So in this case, you see that cybercrime is actually increasing in frequency, while security controls to counter these things are lagging behind by a little bit. Now, the other factor is the proliferation of knowledge. So this benefits both the attackers and defenders, and it can sometimes be a controversial topic, for example, around responsible disclosure. So the thing is, once information gets out there about a particular vulnerability or way to attack something, both the attackers and defenders will hear of it, but defenders are always lagging behind by a little bit. So Eternal Blue, as an example, is a cybercrime exploit developed by the US National Security Agency. So it was leaked by the Shadow Brokers hacker group around April 2017, 1 month after Microsoft released patches for the vulnerability. Now, at the end of 2018, nearly a year later, millions of systems are still vulnerable to this vulnerability, which means it can be attacked by anyone who has access to a computer. And lastly, when we talk about motive, there are multiple motives. Not everyone's just after money. Some people are doing the attacks for political reasons, for nation-state attackers or hacktivists. Some are just business competitors. Some are doing it out of hatred, unsatisfied employees and customers, and so on. So there really is a lot of drivers behind this.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. And there's obviously a large diversity in motive, like you mentioned, so that must be rather difficult to ascertain sometimes. And we know that the accelerated shift of digitization and remote working has pushed these businesses into a radically different cyber risk profile virtually overnight, as a matter of fact. So considering that, what measures should be taken to ensure cyber resilience?
Yes, so as you mentioned, the changes and efforts here would mirror those of any technology transformation efforts. The only difference here is on a much tighter timeline. So with the right security controls, most businesses should be able to adapt without much difficulty. Technologies such as use of VPNs, endpoint security tools, and cloud-based shifts, which were already happening in the background regardless of what's happening in the world out there right now. And proper user security controls such as password management, multi-factor authentication, and better user awareness will all contribute to better security. Now, the major change that IT professionals as well as security professionals will have to get their heads around is how we assess and scope as well as evaluate potential threats. For example, what are the assumptions we make today around security of corporate networks, which should not carry over to your home personal networks? And how does the lack of physical security affect processes where we implicitly assume physical proximity? For example, having a second channel for processors verifying a fund transfer request. In the past, it could be a simple email request followed up by you walking up to the person in the office and asking if it's a real request and not a phishing attempt. But now these processes would need to be tweaked.
Yes, there's obviously some change there, especially with digitization, certainly. And I understand that over the last decade, actually, PrivaSec has delivered a broad range of engagements across various industry sectors, particularly government, financial services, and retail. Which sector would you say brings in maximum clients, and why is that the case?
So for any organization out there, the way cybersecurity is right now is they don't know what they don't know. So this realization of the need for cybersecurity is what drives demand. Now, this realization comes mainly right now from technology-based organizations, from organizations who deal with a lot of PII, personal identifiable information, as well as critical data handling. Some of them come to the realization because they have gone through an actual cybersecurity incident, and sometimes there are regulatory requirements as well as guidelines being issued. So it's quite hard to pin down specific industries, but where there are technology-centric organizations who will naturally realize the need for cybersecurity, or regulated industries, there's always a harder push for security. Now, overall, organizations are moving away from a reactive technical controls only approach to cybersecurity. So instead of seeing a need for a particular vertical, for example, I do not have antivirus, or I do not have a working firewall, and they procure that. The shift we are seeing is that people are moving towards the realization that this is an ongoing demand. This is something that they'll always need. So instead of reacting, they're trying to build information security management systems. So, for example, ISO 27001 is a key standard here. So to support a constantly growing business as well as changing threats, they're building this capability to plan, to do, to check, and to act on cybersecurity controls required according to the risk they face and the direction of the business, the direction of their business, I mean. So no particular industries, but technology-centric organizations and regulated industries make up the main bulk of that push.
Well, that makes perfect sense. So would you say that you see prevention is key to countering these constantly evolving cybersecurity attacks?
So I think prevention has occupied a lot of head space of cybersecurity and IT professionals. In most cases, the organizations that we go into, they might have some preventive controls already implemented. Now, the ability to monitor their systems and ability to respond effectively, that is often where the gaps are.
Right, obviously that does sound like it checks out. These threats can happen very quickly, as you mentioned. It's definitely a matter of time and reacting on time. Now, could you shed some light for us on the advancements in the compliance landscape?
So on a compliance landscape, again, you don't know what you don't know. So a lot of these are community, industry, or regulator-driven efforts, and these are essential in ensuring cybersecurity maturity increases as a whole. Now, cybersecurity is rapidly becoming one of the prominent factors of business decisions made, especially as this awareness grows, and this would drive the overall maturity across the industry. Now, cybersecurity regulations has been evolving, especially in countries in Asia Pacific, even though in many cases it's a game of catch up with the threats out there today. Critical industries, critical infrastructure, the financial industry, healthcare are usually the first to get attention, but this has a flow-on effect to other industries. Now, the other driver here are around data privacy concerns, simply because any large-scale collection and manipulation of data would involve a technology solution. Now, I'll give you an example of how these regulations are evolving. Now, the Council of Financial Regulators in Australia has released a Cyber Operational Resilience Intelligence-Led Exercises Framework, or the CORI framework, to test and demonstrate cyber maturity and resilience of institutions within the Australian financial services industry. So other than a purely technical test, this is what we'll call a red team in our industry. So it could involve physical intrusion and other factors also. Now in Singapore, we have seen standards like ISO 27001 becoming an often reference standard, as well as a point of assurance to external stakeholders, which could be someone who's looking to procure a product from you or your investors. So we often see these standards used as part of the design of guidelines and requirements. And of course, at the back, we hear that these things are being referenced while these standards are being drafted and updated.
I can imagine that's necessary as well, to be constantly updating those standards and regulations to catch up. Like you said, it does often look like a game of catch up, I imagine. Just before we wrap up now, you operate across Australia as well as internationally with a presence in New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia. Going forward, are there any further plans for expansion?
That's a tough question to answer, but definitely. And for cybersecurity, because we deal with technology, I guess one of the benefits that we get to enjoy is that a large part of the work that we do can actually be done remotely. And people are starting to realize that fact because of the forced shift to remote work due to COVID. And with technology infrastructure, this remote shift can often be made. So right now we are making good headway into Greater Asia, around China, Hong Kong, even countries like India, and sometimes even countries like the US. So expansion is definitely in the plans. Physical expansion might be slowed down due to COVID. However, we are already operating in many of these countries outside of the Asia Pacific market.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. It's always good to hear that you have expansion plans in the works despite the challenges of COVID. And we look forward to seeing expansion into those markets that you mentioned. Although on that note, it's just about time to wrap up. So I've got to say thank you so much, Quan, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great to hear your insights. And thanks for your time as well, viewers. Stay tuned for more live market updates. As we say here, stay apprised and invest wise with 𝐾𝐿.